Well, today we are so excited to have Steve Case here at the Nashville Entrepreneur Center in the Chase Studio. And I appreciate you bringing you and your team and your wisdom into our community. And I appreciate the fact that you all invest in founders in our community. I know I've received emails from several that are very appreciative of the investment, the knowledge, the wisdom, and the fact that you are here. So
Well, it's
thank
great
you.
to be back. Obviously, a great city on the move.
Yeah, thank you. I want to really, I go back to I really just want to tell your story,
Mhm.
but I want you to tell it. And so I would love to start. I know that your father was a lawyer who moved to Hawaii. Were there any roots to Hawaii, or how did that come about?
Well, actually, both my parents were born in Hawaii, so it was my grandparents that moved there over 100 years ago. So, my dad grew up on one island, Kauai, and my mom on the other, the Big Island. My dad ended up being a lawyer. My mom ended up being a teacher.
Mhm.
So they clearly were the family was there because it was a new opportunity, a new possibility, and so they moved to Hawaii at the time. It was not a state, but there was a sense of adventure, I think, and possibility that probably is part of what makes me an entrepreneur.
Well, that's where I was going, is there's a family lineage there of being willing to take a risk and an adventure. And I wondered whether you felt that was passed through to you and your brother, or, one of the questions is, are entrepreneurs born, are they made, or are they both? And so I wondered from your experience.
Well, I'd say it's a mixed bag. I've met entrepreneurs who definitely from day one kind of had a certain drive and to be an entrepreneur. But I also met a lot of people who kind of stumbled into opportunities later in life, and so I think there's clearly a mix out there. For me, I think growing up, both my parents were relatively conservative in terms of how they think about careers and opportunities, and so we're a little nervous, frankly, when I was on this entrepreneurial journey. Even when we started AOL in 1985, and it was struggling for a few years, they were a little
Hmm.
worried that maybe I needed to get like a real job.
Hmm.
But they always were very supportive of the journey, and it was something I just really felt compelled to do.
And have you, obviously AOL, but been, had you started businesses growing up? Have you,
Oh yeah.
okay.
I did have a lot of little side hustles as a kid growing up, and even in high school and college. So none of them amounted to much, but they did give me some kind of hands-on business experience. I think ended up being helpful.
And then when you went to college, what was your major?
Political science.
Okay. And was the thought you'd go on to be a lawyer, or just,
No, I didn't. I didn't really know exactly, but I was more drawn to business and particularly drawn to something a little more entrepreneurial. And by the time I graduated from college in 1980, I also had stumbled onto the idea of the internet. I remember reading about things in the late 70s, video text, interactive TV, things like that. Read a book by Alvin Toffler, the futurist, called The Third Way. It was talking about this new electronic frontier. I thought that was kind of interesting. And so that was the path I wanted to pursue when I did graduate. But in 1980, when I graduated, there was not really an internet industry to go to because it still
Mhm.
really hadn't happened. And back then, venture capitalists were not backing 21-year-olds with crazy ideas. So I
Mhm.
ended up working for some big companies for a while, Procter and Gamble and then PepsiCo, before kind of moving into the entrepreneurial zone when I moved to DC in 1983.
Do you think going into, because we talk to a lot of students, and there's a question, should we go and work and get some experience and figure out where problems are? Or I've got this crazy idea, should I jump? What are your thoughts?
Both can work. If
Hmm.
you really do have a idea of something you think that you really believe is a interesting potential business and can solve a particular problem, and you have a uh, visibility into how you might be able to do that, there's no reason to put that off. For most people, they're intrigued about a particular sector, but don't necessarily know what the path forward is. And for them, getting some experience at other companies. It could be a big company where there may be a training program, and maybe you get some credibility by being associated with that big company. or it could be a smaller company where you kind of learn firsthand how young companies are started and scaled. So I don't think there's any perfect answer. It kind of depends on what when you are graduating, what are the things that interest you and what are the opportunities that are open to you, and recognize that you just need to take your first step, and that might lead to insights that lead to a second step, which then leads to a third step, and it's definitely a process. So for most people, my experience is they don't know exactly what they want to do. They just have a sense of what they want to do. And so for a lot of people, getting that kind of experience at another company, it does position them well to then potentially launch their own company. But I've certainly met also a lot of people that are really passionate, know exactly what they want to do, and do it right out of school. Sometimes even launching some of these businesses while they're at school. And there obviously been a lot of examples, like Michael Dell was still in school in Texas when he started Dell Computer, and was doing it kind of out of his dorm, and Mark Zuckerberg was kind of doing it out of his dorm at Harvard when he came up with Facebook. So there's certainly those examples, but probably most people end up, even if they wanted to do something more entrepreneurial, having their first chapter or two working for other companies.
So you mentioned you had read a couple of books about this internet, and there was not, it didn't really exist as far as being able to be employed in an industry because the industry didn't exist. What was it? Like, how did that spark you, and what sparked you in looking at it?
Well, the idea that sparked me was that there would be a new way to get information, new ways to learn, new ways to communicate with other people, and that these digital technologies, even though they were still in kind of formation, would be a real unlock, create some opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist. When I was growing up, this was before cable television really took off. There really were just three television networks that people watched: ABC, CBS, and NBC. Most cities had one newspaper, and that kind of dominated the landscape. And the idea that there could be other voices, and also other ways to connect with people using these technologies, struck me as really interesting. It was in some ways more the community aspect to them than anything else that I was intrigued by. So it was based on some core technologies that the government had funded when they funded a organization called DARPA, a defense agency. Basically, the internet was created by the government to withstand nuclear attack. So let's build a network that is resilient, and even if one part of it goes down, the whole network would still exist. That was sort of the underlying idea behind the internet. And then over time, it got commercialized and more available to obviously everybody, every business, every person. But in the early days, it was still a technology. But even then, you could see the glimmers of possibility.
So in the early days, all right, so did you go to work for somebody that's in the technology industry after you left the PepsiCo?
No, I worked after the two big companies. I did join a startup in the Washington, D.C. area that was doing something I thought was pretty interesting. It was, but it ultimately failed. But that was, I think, helpful experience. It was a little bit of a shock that not too long after I joined the company, within the first 6 months or so, it went from being very promising to kind of almost hitting the wall. I had to go through a big round of layoffs and so forth. So it was a little bit of a wake-up call that the startup world is, there's more risk obviously associated with it. But thankfully, two of the people I met there, and I ended up leaving and starting America Online, AOL, in 1985. So initially, that experience was a disappointment, but it led to an opportunity.
And I think that's the word failure. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because that's one thing that we always talk about, is it's a part of every entrepreneur.
Right.
How big or how small, it depends. But failure is so ingrained into this industry or profession, or what, the whole entrepreneurship circle.
Yeah, and then at one level, you don't want to be celebrating failure, because failure is failure. But you have to recognize that if you're taking a big risk, Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't, and that's the nature of that. And that's not just true in the business world around startups. That's true in sports and politics. A lot of different things that if you put yourself out there, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, and you just have to have the fortitude, the resilience to keep fighting on. If it's something that's important to you, you have to learn from those mistakes, learn from those failures, and get back up and get prepare for the next the next round. That is one of the I think one of the key characteristics of successful entrepreneurs, because there's very few companies that are true overnight successes. That they just start and explode, and suddenly it's a big success. There's far more examples of things that really take a long time to develop, and there are lots of ups and lots of downs, and it's much more of a roller coaster. And sticking with it, and assembling a team that shares that conviction, and is equally kind of passionate, persistent resilience is critically important.
And so that brings us to you starting AOL. I think it would be really helpful to explain what the landscape was like back then. I mean, because for some, they just assume there's always been an internet. They
Right.
assume, and so I think for those of us who remember, and even what I've learned in reading your book and other things, is it really was a new frontier.
Oh yeah, it was still early days, and the data back then when we started in 1985, only 3% of people were connected to the internet, and those 3% were using about an hour a week of service, of access. So it's still pretty early days in terms of the adoption of the internet and those technologies. And it really took the better part of a decade before most people decided it was something they wanted to do. And it took a while to get the cost down, took a while to get the convenience, ease of use up, took a while to build services that were compelling. It took a while to build some of the core technologies, infrastructure, the on-ramps, if you will. And so in retrospect, it shouldn't have surprised me that it took 10 years, but at the time it seemed like forever, because what struck me as an obvious idea looked like an elusive idea. But finally, after about a decade, things started really coalescing, and the growth really started to accelerate. I remember it took us 9 years from the time we started to get 1 million customers.
Wow.
And then 9 years later, we had tens of millions of customers. So it was a slow build, and then suddenly things really accelerated.
And then what about even the regulatory government play in the business that you chose to start? Because so many, especially that are starting in a new frontier, there's usually some regulatory body or something that looks to be an impediment, but the people that can see find it to be a challenge
Right.
that can be overcome.
Yeah, no, when we first were getting started, the internet, because it had been government funded, was still restricted to government agencies and educational institutions. So if you worked for some part of the government, or were on a university campus, you could connect to the internet. But average people in their homes and businesses could not yet connect to the internet. And it took several years, and ultimately Congress passed legislation to commercialize the internet, and that's when things started really accelerating. So when we got started, we knew that was going to be a challenge, but we believed that at some point, thankfully it didn't take too long, that the internet would be open to everybody.
So your early days, how many on the team in the first 2 to 3 years?
There's a couple dozen.
Okay.
We got started with the team mostly on the engineering side, but some on the operations side, because we had our own servers and had to operate that. Some on the marketing side, some on the creating the services, content community side. So it was a kind of a relatively small team given what we were trying to accomplish. And we were able to raise a relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme of things. Our first round of venture capital, which took us into the first couple of years, was about $1 million. And so it was compared to what some startups now raise in their first round. It was relatively modest, but that was enough to kind of get us on the path.
And then as far as, we work with founders and they talk about getting the money, and there's a big discussion, what are you going to do with the money? So to get the money for something that arguably was a risk.
Right.
I would think as a VC, it would be looked at as a significant risk. What what was the impetus to get the money in the beginning for something that was so elusive
Right.
in most people's minds?
Well, I think the key thing was some of it was explaining why we thought the idea of the internet had merit, and eventually, consumers would embrace it. But also, we were able to de-risk it from a investment standpoint because coming out of the gates, we were able to establish a partnership, a strategic partnership with one of the big home computer companies at the time. Commodore was the largest home computer company in the early 1980s. They had a computer called the Commodore 64, which is the most popular computer in the country. And we were able to work out a deal with Commodore that they basically said, if you can raise the money to build a service for Commodore owners and operate it, we will take the lead in marketing it, and we'll bundle your software, your access software, with our Commodore computers and our Commodore modems. And so that took a lot of the risk out. There's still risk, but took a lot of the risk out for the investors because it wasn't us trying to do this completely on our own with a rather limited budget. It was, we had this partnership with Commodore, and then a couple of years later we were able to form another partnership with, at the time was another big player in the home computer market, Tandy, with their Radio Shack division, had a computer line. And then we were able to do a deal with IBM, and then we were able to do a deal with Apple. And so we were, in the first few years, it really was about partnership. That's really how we were able to break into the market, and also how we were able to convince venture capitalists to back us.
No, that's fascinating. And I think it's so important, just having people to understand you aren't on an island.
Right.
And it does take working together to bring solutions, which then can sometimes lead to bringing investment dollars.
Yeah, and I think in more and more sectors of the economy now, that's becoming more important. Healthcare, for example, which obviously is a big industry here in Nashville. Partnerships are going to be critical to be successful in the health tech space. It's not just about the software. That's kind of the table stakes. It's the partnerships you forge that give you momentum in that market, kind of de-risk it as well. And so that early lessons I had, now more than 3 decades ago in launching AOL, and the pivotal role partnerships played, I think is something that we're seeing with more and more entrepreneurs, more and more industries. And it is a way to not just be your own little island, as you say. It's to be part of a broader network and have partners that can help credential you and essentially accelerate your growth.
All right, so let's keep on the journey before I ask that question I was getting ready to. So you have a couple dozen people. When did you know, oh yeah, we've got this?
Well, it was, I always believed in the idea of what we were building, but there were definitely some moments where it was, not clear we were going to survive. So I never lost faith in the idea of the internet, but there were some, rocky moments for our company specifically. And it really was, probably when we went public in 1992, that was one signal that we had arrived. We'd been at it for, at the time, about 7 years. We still were pretty small. We had less than 200,000 customers at the time, and in public we raised $10 million in our IPO, so it was still pretty modest. But that was a sign that things were starting to show some more promise. And then a few years later, growth really accelerated, and we had a lot more customers using the service a lot more actively. And at one point, actually, in the probably maybe 98, something like that, the usage was so heavy that our systems went down, and for about 23 hours AOL was inaccessible, which was obviously troubling in a lot of respects, but also was interesting for me because it ended up being a big news story. And like the network TV news and a lot of newspapers in different cities, it was a headline, AOL down. And it was striking because even a decade before, nobody knew or cared what we're doing, and suddenly it was important enough that it was a national story that we were down. That was another moment where it was clear that the internet was coming of age.
And so the rocky the rocky roads there where you questioned, are we going to survive? Because I think every entrepreneur goes through that. Like, you have a vision, you believe in it, you see it, but there are times for most of us that, can I get through it?
Right.
So can you talk about one or two, or how you overcame it, or things along those lines?
Yeah, no, I think we had a bunch of them. One in particular was, I mentioned, we established these partnerships with computer companies, one of them with Apple, and we got Apple to license their brand name to us to create a service called Apple Link Personal Edition. This was in the late 80s. And we launched the service, and then Apple decided, kidding, we don't really want to be partners. We don't really want another company to have our Apple brand name, and pulled out of the deal. And it looked like, the company might not survive that. And it was a tough time, but ultimately, because we couldn't call it, Apple Inc. anymore, we had to rename it. We renamed it America Online, and that actually ended up resulting over a few years later as an acceleration of our growth. So it was a kind of a crisis, and potentially even kind of existential, ended up creating an opportunity. And I think that's often the journey of entrepreneurs, that there are setbacks for sure, there are stumbles, there are times where you start wondering if this is going to work, but if you stick with it, and you're right about your core assumptions of what's going to happen eventually with the business or more broadly in the market, eventually things turn around.
So going from 1 million users to tens of millions of users, how did that come about? Was it marketing? Was it, I mean, I would even think the national story about it being down would have driven people.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but it did help. It became such a, for some people who were used to using the service, it was obviously frustrating because they couldn't get their email or get some basic things they were counting on us for, which I was disappointing to let them down. But as you say, there are also a lot of people who said, well, what is this thing? I mean, why is it suddenly such a big deal that it's not available? And so it probably did kind of catalyze more interest in what we were doing. But more broadly, it was, the internet was coming of age, that we finally were able to convince the personal computer manufacturers to build communications modems into their computers. Before it was a peripheral device, it became more of an integral device. We were able to convince most of the PC manufacturers to bundle our AOL software with their computers. So you basically bought a computer and opened the box and turned it on, and suddenly you were able to connect to AOL with relative ease, and that drove a lot of the momentum in terms of new customers. And we also had a strategy around trying to make it as easy as possible for people to try the service for free, and had kind of distribute a lot of free trial discs, things like that. So some of it was the things that we did, but a lot of it was just the idea of the internet kind of coming of age, and instead of it being viewed as sort of this fringy thing that only a few computer hobbyists would be interested in, suddenly it became something that had broader appeal. And thankfully we were kind of in the right place at the right time when that happened, and so we were the beneficiary of a lot of that growth. At our peak a little over 20 years ago, about half of all the internet traffic in the United States went through AOL, and that was because of that groundwork we did in that first decade, even though it was a struggle. And when things kind of started accelerating, we were able to be the beneficiaries.
And so even in the first decade, I would assume there was a lot of, I always called it building the foundation to be ready for the growth, even though you might not anticipate how fast it would grow once it starts growing. But that clearly was in place for you all to be able to handle the growth.
Yeah, I'd say the first decade went from a couple dozen employees to a couple hundred employees. The second decade, it went from a couple hundred employees to thousands of employees. Our peak was 10,000 employees. So it was definitely the first decade was kind of steady growth in terms of building the business, building out the team, and then things really started accelerating, and that required a different approach to management. Obviously, spending far more time on hiring and people and building a team and setting the overall direction, but really trusting the team to really do most of the work, because it was something as a founder, as a CEO, I couldn't be as involved in things in those later days as I was in the earlier days, and so it really became much more of a team.
Talk about that a little bit. Like when you look at the journey of AOL, was there a part that you just loved? And was or did you love it all? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Well,
Because I think an entrepreneur evolves with their first company, especially if they're lucky enough to have it grow, and obviously yours grew.
well, the odd thing would be that most people looking at it would say that first decade was hard, and the second decade was things really took off. And so clearly, that second decade was the part that you liked more. I actually kind of liked that first decade. That the you know the struggle. I'm not sure I liked it at the time because it was a struggle, but as I think back on it, just trying to still figure things out and kind of deal with all the skeptics who didn't believe in the idea of the company or the idea of the internet. And so, of course, I was gratified when growth finally started accelerating and AOL kind of moved into a leadership position and even became one of the leading voices for around the internet. And as I think back on it, those early years, even though they were challenging, were also a lot of fun.
I think that's important, because I think as a founder, it is hard. There's sleepless nights, it's stress on families, but yet you are really intimately involved with everything.
Right.
And then as you grow, you have to let go and let go and let go. And, some founders find that isn't what they enjoy doing. And maybe there are other people that could come in and do it better. And so, I think that's just a part of the evolution of the journey. Some love it and love every part of it, understanding there's hard knocks everywhere.
Right.
But that's what I just wondered. And then I know you ended up doing the transaction with Time Warner or
Right.
Warner. And talk a little bit about that and how that came about and what the thought was as far as the next evolution of AOL.
Well, I'd say the first part of it, I think I realized as the CEO when things were growing so quickly that if I didn't, delegate more things, we just couldn't scale. I was becoming the impediment to scaling. And so one option would have been to say, I'll step aside as CEO and bring somebody else in. But I decided instead to stay as CEO and keep building the team underneath me to have a skill set in each of the key areas that I didn't have and we didn't previously have. So it became much more of a building the team, kind of dynamic. In terms of Time Warner, it was really ensuring we had a good path to broadband. We were the leader in the 1990s in dial-up modems, what was known as the narrowband world. But the world was moving to broadband, higher speed access, and the cable companies were the principal player in terms of providing that broadband access. And Time Warner had the largest cable company. Also had a lot of other businesses, Warner Brothers and Warner Music and Time Inc. and CNN and HBO, a bunch of other things. But the core asset there that was we thought super important was the path to broadband. And so that's one of the things that drove the merger with Time Warner. As part of that deal, to make sure that deal would happen, I agreed to step aside as CEO. So it was kind of giving up the baby a little bit, giving up the leadership position because I believe strategically we needed to ensure we had that path.
I think it's your story is so unique, but yet the similarities, because I do think there comes a time where what's best for the org strategically is for the founder to possibly step aside, and that's hard. I was with someone last night who's going through that, and it's hard. And I know that's one thing it's almost a support group, and we call them phase 4, people
Right.
who have had the exits and now think, what do I do? And, but clearly you found lots of other things to do. And my guess is you were still on the board,
I stayed on the board for
Yes.
2 or 3 years, and then decided it was time to move on. We just had a difference of opinion about what to do, and I think people on the board and probably the management were getting tired of me, kibitzing on the sidelines, and I was getting frustrated that they were going in different directions. So I just felt like it was time to make a cleaner break, and that's when I just started focusing more on backing entrepreneurs, and that's really been most of the focus for the last couple of decades. Rather than start a new company, I started a firm to back a lot of companies and try to support entrepreneurs on their journey with a particular bias, as you know, and investing in entrepreneurs outside of the usual tech hubs, outside of Silicon Valley, outside of New York, outside of Boston. We think of as sort of the rise of the rest, and that's really been the principal focus, particularly over the last decade.
Hmm. And you've also done public service. I mean, you have volunteered to serve with the federal government and the Smithsonian right now.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about your public service? Because I think that's so important for entrepreneurs who have had nice exits or have the ability to give it back. Can you talk about the different things you do?
Everybody has to make their own decision, but I do feel that you have some opportunities and also some responsibilities in terms of giving back, and most of that for me has been trying to be a voice around policy related to innovation, entrepreneurship, and I've done that in a number of ways, including co-chairing the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and working on legislation around things like the Jobs Act, around capital formation, immigration reform, a bunch of things there. And then also, as you said, I chair the Smithsonian Institution, which we have 21 museums, a lot of research operations. It's the world's largest museum and research complex. I think it's an important part of the country, and part of what we've been focusing on the last few years is how do we continue to make the Smithsonian museums on the National Mall as great as they can be, but also how do we take the best of the Smithsonian to people who don't have the opportunity to come to Washington, D.C.
Sure.
How do we take the Smithsonian to every home and every classroom, and obviously uses a lot of digital technologies to do that. And I think it's important for that institution, which is 176 years old, to have a bright future. And so I'm happy to spend some time on that.
No, and I would just personally say thank you. And then going to the backing entrepreneurs, because obviously what you've done is given voice to, there are really good companies that might not be on the coast. I remember one time one of my clients was on a call and somebody in the Northeast said, well, what good could ever come from the farmland?
Right.
And she said, well, there's a company we work with in Nashville that's I put up against anyone. But I think that there is definitely, before your voice, there wasn't much of a voice about companies coming out of America other than California, New York, and Massachusetts. So what gave you the impetus to do that?
It came out of some of the policy work around innovation policy, and understanding what's happening with job creation, and understanding what's happening with the distribution of venture capital, which was overwhelmingly going to those states you mentioned, California, New York, and Massachusetts. And then we started 8 years ago doing bus tours around the country, now visited dozens and dozens of cities, see firsthand what's happening in those cities, and try to be a champion for innovation entrepreneurship in those cities. Then we launched a venture fund focused on these rising cities. We call the Rise the Rest Seed Fund, that's now made 200 investments in 100 different cities. And more recently wrote the book on Rise the Rest to tell some of the stories that kind of learned from the road. I do think it's important not just to give more people in more places a chance if they have an idea, kind of a chance of building a company, but it's also, I think, the best way, maybe even the only way, to create real renewal and momentum in different communities. How do you create job growth in those communities? I think it's critically important. So that's why it's for me not just a investment strategy. It's a broader movement around trying to level the playing field around innovation entrepreneurship in America.
And with the Rise of the Rest, I think, I'm not sure if your wife was the impetus for the book, but I would like to thank her.
She was one of the voices that said, it's kind of, you have to write this book. It's this is a story that needed to be told, and in the early days of the pandemic when we were all kind of locked down, she said, okay, well, maybe now's the time to start putting pen to paper.
Well, because it is. I mean, you've captured what's working in different communities and what different communities are doing. And I think as we look, I think that's one of the things you don't need to reinvent. You can look at what's working and try to emulate,
right,
or maybe even collaborate together versus trying to start everything from scratch. And as the Entrepreneur Center, it really is, how do we connect people to the resources they need?
Right.
So can you talk a bit about what you've learned? And obviously people need to read the book, but just a little bit of a highlight of what are those resources that you feel are needed to be able to have a thriving ecosystem to be able to let all boats rise, so to speak?
Well, one thing what I mentioned earlier that was part of the policy work, I was asked to chair an initiative called Startup America, and did that about 10 years ago. And then we launched different chapters. So there was a Startup Tennessee, there was a Startup Hawaii, there was a Startup Texas, there was Startup Maryland, and so forth. And I remember even 10 years ago in Tennessee, the governor at the time, Governor Haslam, really said, "Look, this is a moment. How do we focus more on entrepreneurship?" And Nashville obviously is a key part of it, but also they identified some other cities, including Chattanooga, Knoxville, Memphis, as also important kind of tech hubs within Tennessee, and it would then figure out for each of those cities what would be catalytic. And in the case of Nashville, as you know, building this entrepreneur center was part of that, and having a place where people can gather, even in a more digital world, even in a world where people are spending more time on Zoom. Physical spaces still matter, and having entrepreneurs and investors creating opportunities for them to interact in more kind of natural, almost serendipitous ways, I think are important. So that is one part of it. Getting more venture capital, backing entrepreneurs in these rise of risk cities is important. It's still challenging for entrepreneurs in cities like Nashville if they have an idea to figure out who might be able to invest in that idea and help it from being an idea on a piece of paper to a real company. It's also challenging in these rising cities to attract the talent you need to scale the company, and that's getting a little easier because of what's happened with the pandemic and some people deciding to move to other places or people working remotely for companies from other places. So, but that's still a challenge. And the communities themselves need to figure out ways to be more focused and more intentional around the role that new companies play and the role entrepreneurs play, and figure out ways to be more collaborative as a community. So the different constituents, whether it be the big companies or the major universities or the mayor or the whatever it might be, how do they all work together in a way that supports this new generation of entrepreneurs? So it takes a lot of different things, but at this point, I think a lot of it is just being intentional.
And then would you share a little bit about the data that supports that?
Yeah, if you look at venture capital in this country, about 75% of it goes to just 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. So how do you get more capital going to other places is a key part of that. And also, how do you do that with an eye not just to place, but also the people, the data around venture capital going to women, blacks, Latinos, it's really much more difficult for them to raise capital. And so communities need to be intentional, not just about innovation broadly, entrepreneurship broadly, but how do you make sure you have an inclusive startup community?
And what about job growth?
Well, all the net jobs in this country are created by new companies, not by small businesses, not by big businesses, but by new businesses. So if as a community you're not focusing on these new businesses, you're not backing these new entrepreneurs, you're not going to have the kind of job growth in your community that you want and need. You only can get so far by luring other existing companies to move. You have to figure out ways to launch new companies.
And then to circle back on one thing that you mentioned as far as diversity, funding for diverse or women, why is it important? Other than it's socially something, a social thing that we need to do to help everyone rise. But why do you believe it's important based on what you've seen by going around the country?
I think it's, basically entrepreneurs see a problem and decide it's an opportunity. And different people with different lived experiences are going to see different problems and therefore, imagine different opportunities. And so you need kind of in hockey, the teams that tend to win are the ones that have more shots on goal. Mm-hmm. So how do you get more shots on goal? How do you get more people on the playing field? And how do you make sure that it's a diverse mix of entrepreneurs that really are reflective of your community?
Well, I've got to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate you spending this with us, and I believe there's so many little nuggets that will be helpful to so many people in our ecosystem and our constituency. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to have this time with you, and I really do appreciate you sharing it with us.
Well, thank you, and thank you for everything you're doing to kind of create this anchor within this platform within the Nashville startup community. So it is a gathering place and can kind of drive the collaboration and sense of possibility that can take Nashville to the next level.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.